LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. I've picked out a little over 20 of the weekend's best clips from the Sunday morning news analysis shows on the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News that make up the corporate media here in the United States. I won't have any political comedy clips this week because Saturday Night Live and HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher were both off for the week, but I will be taking a serious look at the topics I've listed down in the video description, and if you're watching this as a recorded show, you should see time indexes down there to skip to the topics that interest you. I'll have almost all the clips, though, on the big news from Monday night from a St. Louis grand jury deciding not to charge Officer Darren Wilson for killing unarmed black teenager Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri last August. And after I show you about a dozen clips on that topic, I'm also going to use my experience of having once been a criminal defense attorney in St. Louis County, Missouri, to show you one of several specific instances where prosecutors heavily favored Officer Wilson in front of the grand jury. I'm going to show you some still captures from the grand jury testimony. And then after that, I'm going to have a few clips on the ongoing controversy on immigration in the aftermath of President Obama's executive order deferring deportation for millions of undocumented immigrants. And then I'll have this final clip at the end about this new split in the Democratic Party. But like I said, I want to start with and spend most of the show on the Ferguson, Missouri news, starting with the breaking news that Officer Darren Wilson resigned from the Ferguson Police Department over the weekend. And that's in an update on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos from reporter Alex Perez over in this clip.
Good morning, Martha. A relatively quiet night of much smaller protests here in Ferguson. Just 2 arrested. Wilson says he hopes his resignation will bring peace.
Darren Wilson, a 3-year veteran of the police department, said he had hoped to continue in police work, a job he told George Stephanopoulos that he loved.
I greatly enjoyed working in Ferguson. I did.
Put that in the past tense, not going to happen again.
Do you really think it's possible? I mean, do you think they would accept me? Do you think it'd be safe for me?
In his resignation letter, Wilson wrote, "I have been told that my continued employment may put the residents and police officers of the city of Ferguson at risk, which is a circumstance that I cannot allow." After the grand jury decided not to indict Wilson, violent protests erupted here and then spread across the country. For nearly a week now, protests have continued. On Black Friday, groups disrupting big box retailers and forcing one St. Louis mall to shut down.
No Black Friday! No Black Friday!
Pastor Willis Johnson's church is just down the street from the Ferguson police station, the target of many protests. He condemns the violence, but understands the anger.
Why is this so emotional for so many people?
It's so personal. It's so hurtful to know that there's no recourse. There's no sense of respect. There's no dignity.
What's next for Ferguson, you think?
Very tough conversations. Very real work.
And Pastor Johnson says his sermon today will be about holding the entire community responsible and finding a place of hope and healing for Ferguson.
Now, I guess, yeah, that's the update from Ferguson from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. But did you notice that when they showed the clip of Officer Wilson meeting George Stephanopoulos, how big Officer Wilson looked? Here, I actually took a capture of that. Here, check this out. And, you know, the other thing I noticed about this interview between George Stephanopoulos and Officer Darren Wilson was that it was taped last Tuesday, which was really too quickly for ABC to really use the grand jury transcripts to cross-examine Officer Wilson. And Officer Wilson really seemed to be able to fall back on what sounded like pretty well-rehearsed talking points to me. For example, there's this one question and answer that they showed on this morning's This Week with George Stephanopoulos that I think shows a slightly probing but not really probing question because it's not based on the grand jury transcripts, and sort of a rehearsed talking points type answer from Officer Darren Wilson over in this clip.
A lot for him to look at.
You described, I guess, the fear you were thinking. You thought he was coming after you.
Yes.
On the street. Was any part of you angry? You know, No anger.
No. There was no time for anger. Like I said, training took over with survival mode.
Because some of the witnesses have said they thought you were out of control, that somehow you had snapped.
That would be incorrect. There was never, the only emotion I'd ever felt was fear, and then it was survival and training.
And the training kicked in.
Training took over. It didn't just kick in, it took over.
And in your training, there was no option in those moments when you were faced with Michael Brown but to shoot.
Correct.
So yeah, that seemed like, police officers are already sort of professional witnesses anyway, and that seemed like very well rehearsed talking points. The whole like no anger, no time to think, just went into training and survival mode. And I also thought that a lot of the story that Darren Wilson told in his 4-hour grand jury testimony had some unbelievable parts in it, and wasn't very well cross-examined. And I'll at the end of these clips, I'm going to show you. I'm going to go through some of the grand jury testimony and show you a specific instance where he should have been better cross-examined. But I'm not the only person who had problems believing what Officer Darren Wilson said before the grand jury. Also on This Week with George Stephanopoulos, they had a St. Louis Alderman, Antonio French, who I've shown clips of in the past weeks I've covered this topic. And you can see him say that he didn't find him believable, and also found him kind of cold and remorseless over in this clip.
And change.
Did you believe Officer Wilson's testimony?
No, I found Officer Wilson to be remorseless, cold, and frankly, a lot of his answers sounded like they were prepared by a lawyer. And so what I worry is that, as we said back in August, that the way this trial or this grand jury process was being carried out by the county executive, by the county prosecutor, that it really doesn't give what the community needs in order to move forward. No closure, no resolve, and in fact, it just creates more anger.
And like I said, I'm going to go more into the evidence in just a few minutes and pick apart some of the evidence. But in terms of the aftermath and the way people reacted to it, I also want to show another clip from Alderman Antonio French where he criticized both the prosecutor for doing this evening announcement, which exacerbated the problem with the riots and looting, and then also criticized Missouri Governor Jay Nixon for having called the state of emergency and mobilized the National Guard, and then not really using the National Guard. And I'll talk about that a little more after you see Antonio French, Alderman from St. Louis, make that point here.
Talk about the aftermath. As we saw, your office was burned. Your own storefront office, which was called Heal St. Louis. Do you think there could have been a better response? Let's listen to Captain Ron Johnson from the Missouri State Highway Patrol.
If any of us knew last night was going to be what it was, if we had a crystal ball, we'd have probably done something different, but we could have never imagined that.
Is that right? Could they never have imagined that?
No, I don't think that's right at all. We've been talking for weeks about this, and that, we really had a powder keg here. And so for the county prosecutor to decide to release the grand jury announcement at nighttime, for the governor to preemptively call a state of emergency and call in the National Guard, yet no one deploy them to West Florissant or other areas that have been hit repeatedly by violence, it really showed a failure to grasp the situation and to handle it on the part of government. And so the fires that we saw, the violence that we saw, was unfortunate. It is, it really hurts our hearts. We've gone through a tough week here. But we knew that a lot of people were very angry, and we knew a lot of people were coming from other places. So we should have been better prepared for this.
So that's sort of a bigger picture look at how the aftermath of the announcement, and the announcement itself was not handled very well in St. Louis, both by the prosecutor Bob McCullough, who was responsible for deciding to announce it at 8 o'clock at night Central Time. I'm pretty sure it was 8 p.m. or right around 8 p.m. that they announced it. And then also criticism of Missouri Governor Jay Nixon for not utilizing the National Guard to stop some of that looting after there was sort of an overreaction to the protests back in August, and now there's sort of an underreaction and underpreparedness for what happened the night of the announcement. And, you know, I talked about putting that in a bigger picture. The real bigger picture that I thought was kind of interesting from the Sunday morning shows this morning was a report from Chuck Todd talking about President Obama's history dealing with the issue of race. And this is about 3 minutes long, but I want to show you this whole clip talking, you know, goes through not just his reaction on Monday night with sort of the split screen. I showed that on Fox News, how they tried to, I thought, juxtapose it in a way to put blame on Obama or shame on Obama or somehow have it negatively reflect on Obama. But there were several other news outlets that also sort of did that same juxtaposition, not quite as starkly as Megyn Kelly did on Fox News. And so I wanted to show this bigger picture where it starts with that reaction of President Obama to the announcement on Monday, but also goes back through Trayvon Martin and the Reverend Jeremiah Wright back from the 2008 campaign, and that situation in Cambridge where the professor Henry Louis Gates was arrested for basically breaking into his own home, and that led to that beer. So anyway, it's all in this like 3-minute review of President Obama and race that I thought was pretty good from Chuck Todd on NBC's Meet the Press this morning here.
Handle that most explosive of issues.
There is not a black America and a white America and Latino America and Asian America. There's the United States of America.
President Obama, who cast himself as a symbol of hope for a post-racial America a decade ago, saw that vision splinter again this week, replaced by the split-screen reality.
We are a nation built on the rule of law. And so we need to accept that this decision was the grand jury's to make.
On one side, images of tear gas and protests. On the other, a cautious commander-in-chief who is running out of time in office. The president's reticence after a grand jury decided not to indict Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson in the shooting death of unarmed teenager Michael Brown stands in stark contrast to the highly personal comments the president made after another teenager, Trayvon Martin, was shot by a civilian 2 years ago.
You know, if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon. Another way of saying that is Trayvon Martin could have been me 35 years ago. There are very few African-American men in this country who haven't had the experience of being followed when they were shopping in a department store. That includes me.
Barack Obama has had to shoulder the burdens and expectations of being the nation's first black president since before he was elected to the job. 6 years ago, then candidate Obama gave what was then a risky speech about his experience as a black man in America, his hand forced by the controversy over former pastor Jeremiah Wright.
I can no more disown him than I can disown my white grandmother, a woman who loves me as much as she loves anything in this world, but a woman who once confessed her fear of black men who passed her by on the street.
That speech was praised, but a year later, he learned that launching a conversation on race could have pitfalls when he criticized law enforcement for arresting Harvard professor Henry Louis Gates.
The Cambridge police acted stupidly. There is a long history in this country of African Americans and Latinos being stopped by law enforcement disproportionately. And that's just a fact.
Police union officials in Cambridge called for an apology. The president backed away from his criticism and diffused the controversy with a photo op, a beer summit. The president's supporters have sometimes been more willing to say the color of his skin may impact how some Americans perceive his presidency than Obama himself.
There's also a dark vein of intolerance in some parts of the party.
Former Secretary of State Colin Powell indicted the Tea Party on this show last year. This week, hesitant to criticize law enforcement, the president has argued that though there are still problems, the country has made enormous progress in race relations. But some disagree.
Ferguson signifies the end of the age of Obama. It's a very sad end.
Nearly 6 years into the Obama presidency, household income for African Americans is just $35,000 a year. That's $20,000 less than for whites, and no better than when the president took office. White unemployment was 4.8% last month. Black unemployment was 10.9%. Black men are more than 6 times as likely as white men to be incarcerated. And black men between the ages of 15 and 19 are 21 times as likely as whites to be killed by a police officer.
So I thought that was a really good use of what Sunday morning shows do well, which is put things in a context using, archival footage and going over the span of the entire Obama administration and looking at how he's dealt with race in several different cases. So I thought that was worth watching and worth showing the whole 3 minutes there. You can let me know what you think down in the comment section, whether that was a good report on Obama's history with race. And another interesting piece of information they brought out on NBC's Meet the Press this morning, Chuck Todd had Massachusetts outgoing governor Deval Patrick, and he's not only the outgoing governor of Massachusetts, and he's also the former head of the Civil Rights Division in the Department of Justice under the Clinton administration. So he knows a little bit about this ongoing Justice Department investigation of what's going on in Ferguson, or at least how it should happen. And so Chuck Todd asked him about that, and here's how he explained what he thinks is going on with that investigation here.
Well, it's a higher bar, as we were talking about off camera, that the DOJ has to consider. It's a consideration about whether there's been a violation of civil or constitutional rights. That is different from what the grand jury in a state prosecution has to consider, and it'll be a tough case to prove. And I say that without, or that is to bring. I say that without knowing all the puts and takes of the case and what all the facts are. It'll be very difficult. It's very important, I think, that DOJ is investigating it, and I know that Attorney General Holder has been urging that investigation, and will drive it through to conclusion.
Did you want
to? So I don't know. That doesn't sound very optimistic. The higher bar for a civil rights violation, but I guess anything's possible, and it's also more likely that there'll be some sort of sanction from the Justice Department on the city of Ferguson for its racist practices in terms of pulling over African Americans at like a much higher rate than their percentage of the population or any other kind of rational measure. And on the subject of racism and how this Ferguson, Missouri case is one in a long string of racist interactions between police and African Americans, I want to show one more clip from NBC's Meet the Press. This is Sherrilyn Ifill, who is the head of the NAACP's Legal Defense and Education Fund, and she actually made this interesting point about how social media may be responsible for our greater knowledge of these incidents that have been going on for decades, and I'll talk about that a little more if you see that clip here.
Universal agreement on this.
I actually have to disagree on this one.
Okay.
We're all looking at Mike Brown, but the issue of law enforcement and the killing of unarmed African Americans and the assault of unarmed African Americans has been going on for decades and actually has nothing to do with Barack Obama. My first exposure to this issue occurred when I was 10 years old, when a 10-year-old boy named Clifford Glover was killed by an officer named Thomas Shea in New York. This is in the early 1970s. The difference now is that we have these photos, we have these cell phone pictures. This is an issue that civil rights organizations have been working on forever, and we haven't been listened to. People haven't believed us.
Do you think social media, if we had it 30 years ago, would have expedited this conversation, expedited this, frankly, uncomfortable moment that we're having?
Yeah, and it is an uncomfortable conversation. One of the reasons we don't make progress is because it's so uncomfortable we can't sit with the conversation. So every time we bring up this issue, for example, we start talking about violence in the black community, or what some people call black-on-black crime, which is a really important conversation to have. We should have a whole show about it. But it doesn't have to do with the power of the state, of law enforcement, to follow you, to shoot you in public housing in a stairway, to kill a 12-year-old boy for carrying a toy gun, to kill a man in Walmart for carrying a toy gun, to kill people who are unarmed, to tase someone in front of their children. We're not just talking about Mike Brown. We're talking about the way in which law enforcement engages the African American community.
And and I think that's a really important point from the head of the NAACP's Legal Defense and Education Fund, Sherrilyn Ifill, apparently a cousin to Gwen Ifill, who is from PBS and has moderated some presidential debates, or vice presidential, I can't remember the last cycle which one she did, but I also want to show a couple clips from CNN State of the Union. First, there's a police chief there from Detroit who Candy Crowley asked this important question that I don't think I heard asked enough. It actually, you see I have my book up here, The New Jim Crow, about the racist criminal justice system, how it's mass incarceration is a new form of racist control. And one of the points that Michelle Alexander makes in that book is that it's not only white police officers that are racist in this situation, but black police officers are also instruments of the same racist system, and they are often put in the same position and have the same reactions as the white officers. And anyway, Candy Crowley asked the chief of police of Detroit, his name is James Craig, about this whole thing about black officers and their ability to also be part of a racist criminal justice system, and I'll talk about that a little more if you see it here.
And Detroit Police Chief James Craig. Chief Craig, let me start this with you and then go to Chief Aziz, and that is, there are also studies that show that black officers have also, shot minorities, have had complaints against them, and it makes me wonder whether this is about race or this is about power.
That's a great point, Candy, because in my tenure, looking back, rarely do you hear the outcry if it's a black officer that's involved in a shooting and the suspect is black. It's always the reverse. And so it doesn't mean you can't follow the same steps. When I look back, and we talk about Ferguson today, and I think back about Detroit in the 70s and where Detroit came from in terms of building those trust-based relationships, it would not matter whether the officer was black or white, given in a city that's 80% African-American, but it certainly fuels it. I think back about Malice Green in the early 90s, where Malice Green, a black suspect, was beaten by white officers. Certainly that fueled a lot of anger, but there was no civil unrest. Now, of course, both officers were convicted as a result of that, unlike in the Rodney King affair that, the officers were acquitted. But that said, Detroit still didn't have any outcry. There were some peaceful demonstrations, of course. And even here, Ferguson, the dialogue has restarted. And like most cities in America, we've had our protests.
Right.
But they've all been peaceful. And that's based on relationship.
Right.
And yes, the good community relationship is more important than the race of the officers, although that is one of the things I guess they're going to try to fix in Ferguson, Missouri, because in the second broadcast of CNN State of the Union, they broke into the broadcast with a news conference from Ferguson, Missouri, and they had the mayor, James Knowles, and he had this four-part plan for starting to fix the problem. And one of the things he's going to do is give scholarships to African-American officers to go to the police academy if they'll work in Ferguson for 2 years afterwards to pay for the scholarship. And like I said, I think that it will partly solve the problem, because in Ferguson, I think of their 53 police officers, only 3 were African-American, even though the community is like 2/3 or 3/4 African-American. And some of the other plans are also to have better community relationships between the police and the people in the community, and to make sure that more of the police live in the community. And anyway, here's the 4-point plan from Mayor James Knowles at the news conference this morning that was caught on CNN State of the Union in this clip.
Policeman Darren Wilson.
I have convened a task force made up of residents, businesses, and law enforcement to create a civilian review board that will review complaints and provide citizen input to Ferguson police policies and procedures. The task force meets weekly, and its efforts are already underway. This groundbreaking initiative will be one of the first of its kind in this region. We are also dedicated to improving the relations between the Ferguson Police Department and our youth. Police Chief Thom is committed to working with the area school districts to establish a Police Explorer program for students in the surrounding districts. The Police Explorer program will be implemented in schools in the fall of 2015. Third, the City of Ferguson has established a scholarship program to recruit African American candidates to attend the police academy. The scholarship would be repaid by an employment commitment to the City of Ferguson for 2 years after the completion of the academy. This initiative is a proactive step in making the department more reflective of the demographics of our community. Finally, myself, along with the Ferguson City Council, are committed to increasing the residency incentive for police officers in the City of Ferguson. In 2015, we will pass an ordinance for a stipend increase from the current $100 to $300 per month for officers who are living in our community. Encouraging police officers to reside in the City of Ferguson will help ensure officers are invested in the community in which they serve.
So, I mean, all those things sound good, like, a citizen review board over police shootings. Incentives for officers to live in the community, the scholarships, and, the outreach. All that stuff sounds good, but I don't think it really gets to some of the heart of the racist criminal justice system that they talk about in the new Jim Crow, based in the drug war and the unfair policing of African Americans for the same level of drug use that you can see in the white community. You just don't see the number of arrests and convictions and people in jail for it. And there's it's a really good book that I recommend, and I'm still hoping to make a video based on that and based on what happened in Ferguson sometime soon. But I do want to show you several clips now on the evidence that was presented to the grand jury, and then, like I said, after that I'm going to go through several pages from the grand jury transcripts of Officer Wilson's testimony and show how I think he wasn't well cross-examined. But first I'm going to show a few clips from Fox News Sunday where they had a debate between an attorney for Officer Darren Wilson. His name, let me make sure I get it right here, is Neil Bruntrager, something like that, Bruntrager, I think. And then they also had an attorney, Daryl Parks, for Michael Brown's family, and they both talked about the evidence. And I thought that Chris Wallace's presentation, his questions were really biased in favor of Officer Wilson rather than Michael Brown. I think the most biased one is this first one where he's ostensibly asking a challenging question of the attorney for Officer Wilson, asking him, why did Officer Darren Wilson have to get out of the car? Why didn't he just stay in the car? But as part of the premise, he says that it's pretty clear from all the evidence that Michael Brown was going for Officer Wilson's gun, which, there was definitely a struggle between the two of them, but as to who was the aggressor and whether he went for the gun, that is definitely disputed by the witnesses. But anyway, here you can see sort of this biased question masquerading as a confrontational question from Chris Wallace to this Neil Bruntrager, or however you say his last name, the attorney for Officer Darren Wilson, in this clip.
So, Mr. Bruntrager, let me pick up on that, because there seems little question that Michael Brown, from the forensic evidence, that Michael Brown attacked Officer Wilson in his car, grabbed for his gun. But here, I think, is the question that a lot of people ask. Why did Wilson get out of the car and follow Michael Brown? Why not just stay in his car, follow him if need be in the car, and wait for backup when there'd be more people and they could subdue him without a shooting death?
The information that we have is that Michael Brown, immediately after the shots are fired in the car, immediately after the scuffle in the car, Michael Brown takes off. Michael Brown's running away. Darren Wilson's job is to keep his eyes on Michael Brown. And he has said, both in his statements on August 9th, on August 10th, in front of the grand jury, in his statements to the feds, he has said to them, listen, the reason I got out of the car was not to arrest Michael Brown. I couldn't he didn't believe for a minute that he could subdue Michael Brown by himself. His job getting out of the car was to keep eyes on him. Wherever he went, he had to see where he went,
sir,
because he believed that Michael Brown posed a threat to others.
Why not just follow him in his car and wait for the backup?
Well, because what if he gets off the road? What if he gets into the neighborhood, which is exactly where he was going? You can't follow everywhere in the car itself.
Mr. Parks, your
and
reaction?
His job is to keep eyes on him.
So yeah, you can see there that Chris Wallace was semi-confrontational with the officer, Darren Wilson's lawyer, Neil. Let me see if I get it right this time. After I even heard him say it at the beginning, it was Neil Bruntrager, not Tragan, Bruntrager. And I'm going to show you where here when the attorney for the family of Michael Brown, Daryl Parks, tried to argue that Officer Darren Wilson shot at Michael Brown while he was running away, which several people said in testimony. You'll see Chris Wallace tries to argue with them based on the autopsy, and I think Daryl Parks gets the better of this argument, but you can tell me what you think after I show you that clip over here.
His job is to keep eyes on him.
Well, a couple of problems, Chris. One, when the officer got out of the car, witnesses have testified that he continued to shoot at Michael as Michael was running away. And there also
he wasn't. Wait. He
wasn't
shot. Wait, Mr. Parks. He wasn't shot in the back. He was shot in the front.
Okay, but let me say this here. Just because you're shooting at him doesn't mean you have to have hit him, Chris. You're confusing two things, and that's part of the problem that's happened in this case, that just because I shoot at you, it's obvious that a few of the shots that the officer shot missed him. It is possible, though, that one of the shots to his arm could have possibly come from the back. So, I think we don't need to confuse the two things. Yes, witnesses say he shot at him. He may have missed him, right? But at some point, Michael turned around, and even the officer testified as if his body had jerked, as if he had been hit. So, although people glance over the aspect of the fact that what made Michael turn around, he didn't just turn around by happenstance. He turned around because he had been hit, and the witnesses further testified that Michael said, "Hey, why are you shooting? Quit shooting." And
well,
was trying
let me bring in Mr. Bruntrager.
So yeah, I think that is true what Daryl Parks explained to Fox News host Chris Wallace there about just because he wasn't hit in the back doesn't mean that Officer Darren Wilson didn't shoot at him while he was running away, and there was that one injury in the arm that could have been consistent from coming from behind. But apparently there are a lot of shots that Officer Darren Wilson didn't hit most of the time that he shot there, and there are a lot of missed shots, and so those could have been the ones when he was running away. At least it is consistent with the people who said that he was shot at while he was running away. And then I also want to show, here's a slightly more confrontational question from Chris Wallace to the attorney for Darren Wilson, Neil Bruntrager. And I don't know why I have such problems with that name. And this is about the very low standard for a grand jury that as long as there's some evidence of guilt, they're supposed to indict. And but then even in that question, he has to say, he has to preface it by saying, of course, the grand juries didn't find that evidence or didn't find that standard was met. And he, I think, lets the attorney for Darren Wilson do a pretty long and involved job of defending the grand jury and not really addressing the problems with the prosecution. That you'll see Daryl Parks chimes in at the very end about that over in this clip.
Let me bring in Mr. Bruntrager, because the fact is that the legal standard in grand juries, which is probable cause, is a pretty low standard, and generally speaking, grand juries are instructed to indict if there is, quote, some evidence of guilt. Didn't they reach that standard? Obviously, the jurors didn't think so.
No, they didn't. But look, when you look at the Missouri statutes regarding grand juries are formed for a number of reasons, one of which is investigation. They can be called to do just what they did here, and that's to look at all this information and decide. I find it astonishing that we have criticism of this grand jury because people say they were given way too much information. They were given way too much to think about. Now, these grand juries operate in an entirely different way than what we call a petit jury. That would be a trial jury. They're given the opportunity to look at information. They can then leave. They have sometimes a week between sessions. They can ask questions if they want, unlike regular juries. I mean, this grand jury clearly looked at everything. They asked questions. They were engaged. I don't know how Mr. Parks says we get in the head of the prosecutor by perhaps some means to sort of figure out that impliedly they didn't want an indictment. I don't see that. I've read these transcripts. What I see is a prosecutor who put all of this information in front of a grand jury and said, you decide.
Gentlemen, I got time for one more issue I want to get into with you. Mr. Parks.
Chris, if I may though, Chris,
real quickly.
Issue. We're not indicting the grand jury. I don't blame the members of the grand jury for what it resulted here. I think the process was flawed that was laid out by the prosecutor.
Okay, Mr. Parks.
Yeah, and I'm glad that Daryl Parks there, the attorney for the Michael Brown's family, got to put in that piece of truth after that long answer about the grand jury. I mean, it's kind of a straw man saying that the grand jury got all this information and you can't fault them for that, because it's not the amount of information, it's the way it was presented and the way that Darren Wilson was allowed to testify apparently for about 4 hours with very little cross-examination. I've read the entire transcript of his testimony. I haven't read all the grand jury evidence. There's like too much there for me to have been able to go through all of it, but I've read a significant amount of it, and I'll get to that in a little bit when I show how I think Darren Wilson got away with bringing in this whole robbery of the convenience store, the Cigarello strong-arm robbery, into his testimony in a way without cross-examination that he should have been allowed to do if the prosecutor was doing their job. But before I get to that, I want to show a few more clips on the problem with the evidence in the grand jury. Here's one from Governor Deval Patrick when Chuck Todd asked, was he sorry that there wasn't an indictment? He talked about how a transparent trial would have been a lot better for the community over in this clip.
Drive it through to conclusion.
Did you want to see an indictment?
Look, without knowing all the facts, of course I wanted to see an indictment, mostly because I think a trial and the transparency of a trial would be good for the community. And because so many of us have the supposition that police officers are not going to be held accountable and not going to have to answer for the shooting of unarmed young black teenagers. But the facts and the process, as the president says, does have to be respected. That is separate and apart from the anxiety so many black people have about encounters with law enforcement, the anxiety that some in law enforcement have about their encounters with black people, and the startling lack of understanding between the two.
You know, is it?
And I think that there would have been a lot more community understanding if there had been a trial, or as I said last week, and I showed in the excerpt video that I uploaded earlier in the week about the unfair grand jury process and prosecutor, I think that if the prosecutor had decided just to charge, because the prosecutor should not have gone ahead to the grand jury if the prosecutor believed there wasn't enough evidence to go to trial. That's the prosecutor's job, is not to go forward if in the prosecutor's judgment there's not enough evidence for any jury to convict. So if the prosecutor believed there was enough evidence to go forward to the grand jury, the prosecutor also could have skipped the grand jury and come up with whatever charge, involuntary manslaughter even, or actually could have done, they don't have to choose a charge. They could have done all of the possible charges, brought it to a preliminary hearing, which would have been public, and we could have seen the cross-examination. It would have been in front of a judge controlling the rules of evidence. That would have been a lot better system, I think. Of course, this may still get in front of a jury in terms of a civil suit. Like I said, I don't think the Department of Justice investigation is likely to result in any kind of criminal case, but it might result in some kind of settlement with the city of Ferguson for their racist practices in the past. But it sounds like there might be a wrongful death case over on CBS, and these are the last clips I'm going to show before I do my own analysis of the grand jury testimony that's in response to something Nora O'Donnell said on CBS's Face the Nation. Nora O'Donnell's was hosting, filling in for Bob Schieffer this morning. Here she is talking to Benjamin Crump, another attorney for the Michael Brown family, asking what their next legal steps are, and he mentions the possible wrongful death suit over in this clip.
No, the family will pursue all the legal avenues, potential civil wrongful death lawsuit, as well as look at pushing forward with proposed legislation for the Michael Brown law, working with the National Bar Association, the NAACP, National Action Network, and others to have it where it is required that every police officer in every American city is required to have video body cameras so to be transparent, and we won't see this play out over and over again, whether it's in New York or Louisiana or Texas. You see young people of color, especially young black and brown boys, being killed at the hands of the people to protect and serve them, and they're never held accountable, largely due to this process, this grand jury process that needs to be indicted. It's broken. It continues to yield the same results over and over again, where they kill our children and they're never held accountable. We have to change that entire process to have a special prosecutor appointed, and Justice Scalia spoke to the function of a grand jury in a Supreme Court decision, and what we saw that happen in Ferguson was nothing like what Justice Scalia and the Supreme Court said the function of the grand jury was.
Mr. Crump.
And that function of the grand jury, I think he's referring to as something like what Chris Wallace was saying on Fox News Sunday, that if there's some evidence of guilt, they're supposed to indict. They're not really supposed to determine conflicts in the evidence and decide one way or another who's telling the truth. If there's some evidence that's credible, even if there's contradictory evidence, they're supposed to indict, and they always seem to indict. And I actually kind of like all three of those things that Benjamin Crump was talking about there, about having a special prosecutor instead of having the police, or having the prosecutors investigate the police who they usually have a really close relationship, and the body camera idea, and maybe the wrongful death lawsuit. I mean, those are all things that the attorneys for Michael Brown might do in the future. But I also want to show another clip from Benjamin Crump. This is talking about his reading of the grand jury transcripts that I'm going to get to my own reading in a little bit. But here he is talking about how it showed that the prosecutor was really biased in favor of the police officer over in this clip.
They think their child was running from the police, and they thought that he was giving up. And when they look at these release documents, it shows you just how partial this prosecutor's office was. Look at the way they questioned the people who came out and said that Michael Brown did nothing wrong and it was the police officer's fault, compared to the people who supported the police officer, and especially the shooter, Darren Wilson. Look at how they let him testify for 4 hours and never cross-examined him. And this killer of an unarmed person has never been cross-examined, and it is so unbelievable to all lawyers you talk to that you wouldn't even ask him one tough question. We had often said, after we looked at this transcript, a first-year law student would have did a tougher cross-examination than this prosecutor's office did to the killer of an unarmed kid in broad daylight. And so it further builds the mistrust that many in the African-American communities all across America have with this process and the local law enforcement and court officials.
Mr.
And like I said, I'm going to show you a couple more clips, and then I'm going to show you one example I found where there was really bad cross-examination of Officer Darren Wilson by the prosecuting attorneys from Bob McCullough's office in this case. And one thing, I've been trying to read through the comments that you've been leaving down in the comment section while I've been doing the show. I noticed there was one comment there when I was talking about going to trial. Several people were talking about that, and I saw people asking about whether there would be a conviction if they went to trial. And I actually don't know. I would like to see the evidence tested at a trial, but it's quite possible that it wouldn't end up being guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Although I think, I mean, it's hard to say without actually having a public trial where there's real cross-examination. And I want to show a clip here where Nora O'Donnell actually brings up this really interesting statistic from the U.S. Attorney's Office in terms of federal grand juries. This isn't in Missouri, which was a state case, but in terms of the number of cases that U.S. attorneys brought to the grand jury and the number that got indicted. And then also you'll see Benjamin Crump answering the question about the possible acquittal if it had gone to trial. But here's an interesting statistic about grand jury indictments in the federal system to start off the question here.
Court officials.
You know, Mr. Crump, I'm no lawyer, but I've heard the phrase, you know, that grand juries can indict a ham sandwich. And so we went and looked at the numbers. And in fact, numbers compiled by the Bureau of Justice Statistics showed that in 2010, prosecutors tried 162,000 federal cases and grand juries declined to return an indictment in just 11 of them. So I know how you feel that this process was broken in this particular case. Would you have preferred a trial? And what if he had been acquitted, though? What if Officer Wilson had been acquitted?
People can accept that more, Nora, when you have what we have set as the foundation for the American justice system, trial by jury, where it's all transparent, where all the evidence and the witnesses are cross-examined and vetted. People think that's fair. People think that's impartial. But when you have this secret grand jury proceeding where there's only one lawyer in the room, and that lawyer is the local prosecutor who has a symbiotic relationship with the local police department and the local police officer and has no relationship or no regard for this young person of color, and then you see the results all the time coming out with they are exonerated, they're cleared, they're swept under the rug, and we're told to just go on and get over it. Well, we can't continue just to go ahead and get over it because these are our children that are being killed. The statistics are alarming. A young black man between the ages of 15 and 19 is said to be likely to be killed by the police 21% more than anybody else, and they are stopped 3 times by police more than anybody else. So we have to get police officers who are not cold as ice like the shooter of Michael Brown, but police officers who care about trying to have a relationship with the community, not seeing the citizens of low-income communities or minority communities as demons, as criminals, but as citizens that we all have to be together and that we're all in the same boat and we have a vested interest. Unless we have this serious dialogue, we're going to continue to see this happen over and over again. And the Michael Brown and the souls of thousands of people of color cry out for the grave, saying we have to fix this system.
Benjamin Crump.
So that's kind of moving rhetoric at the end there from Benjamin Crump, attorney for Michael Brown. And I agree with most of what he said. You can let me know what you think down in the comments section. But I want to get to this last point that I've been promising to make about how some of the grand jury testimony was really uncross-examined, Darren Wilson's grand jury testimony. And the place I'm going to use as the starting off point is a discussion that was on CBS's Face the Nation. One of the people they had on was this writer for the Atlantic. His name is Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he started to make a point about one of the problems in the case of Officer Darren Wilson stopping Michael Brown, and or that the stop of Michael Brown was really a problem that people haven't concentrated on enough. Not so much the violence, but why he was stopping him in the first place. And you'll see CBS's substitute host of Face the Nation, Nora O'Donnell, breaks in and says, oh, but Officer Darren Wilson knew about this strong-arm robbery at the convenience store. And I think that was one of the big pieces of misinformation that the attorneys for Officer Darren Wilson or the St. Louis County Police or the prosecutor, that was one of the things that the Ferguson police put out real early was this videotape of Michael Brown stealing these cigarillos, like cigar type things from this convenience store and pushing a clerk out of the way. What they call that a strong arm robbery, because he used force to get out of the store with the cigarillos, apparently, although, that crime was never prosecuted. But so Nora O'Donnell buys this idea that Officer Darren Wilson knew about this strong arm robbery, this alleged strong arm robbery, at the time he was interacting with Michael Brown. But that is really disputed in the testimony and was really uncross-examined by the prosecutors, as I'll show from actual transcripts from the grand jury after I show this clip of, like I said, it starts with this Atlantic writer named Ta-Nehisi Coates talking about the stop and getting corrected by Nora O'Donnell on CBS's Face the Nation this morning here.
Ferguson's relationship with the larger community around it. And I think it's all good to begin the conversation at the point at which there's a lethal confrontation between Michael Brown and Officer Wilson. But why was Officer Wilson stopping Michael Brown for walking down the street? How did we get to that point? We have some pretty good studies on the amount of policing that's endured by African-American communities in Ferguson and how that relates to how
my understanding is that
surrounding counties fund themselves.
Yeah, Ta-Nehisi, my understanding, though, was that he had just received over the radio the report that there had been a robbery and there was a description of a suspect, and that when Michael Brown walked by, he fit that description, and that's why he stopped him on that particular case.
See, some of that's unclear. Officer Wilson says
my understanding was that he was actually walking in the middle of the street, and he hadn't put that together yet.
Right.
Am I correct?
Well, there's confusion because Officer Wilson in the grand jury says he connects those two things. The chief of police of Ferguson actually did not connect those two things, and so this is why you have to have a transparent trial by jury. And I agree with Ta-Nehisi that we can't be too hopeful about change because of the structural things that are in place and the long, hard work that has to happen here. What Ta-Nehisi is talking about in terms of police stops and the bias in the system is thinking about how racial bias informs all these things.
So at least there was some correction. There was James Peterson there at the end, sort of doing a correction as to it being disputed as to whether Officer Darren Wilson knew that there had been this strong arm robbery at the Ferguson market before he had his interaction with Michael Brown. But one of the things I found in the transcript, and I put a link down to Volume 5 of the grand jury testimony transcript. You can look through this all yourself. I'm going to show you all the page numbers. The first is from page 52 of Volume 5. This is testimony of, they don't give his name, it's redacted. This is a sergeant for the Ferguson Police Department who's worked there for 38 years. He was the first police officer on the scene after Darren Wilson shot Michael Brown. He put Darren Wilson in his car, and then Darren Wilson said, "Oh, don't single me out in the car. Things are looking bad here. I don't want to be the subject of public violence," or that's not exactly. I'm paraphrasing. And so the sergeant let Darren Wilson leave and go to the hospital on his own. But one of the things I noticed in his testimony, here are a couple pages where he's being. This is the sergeant, unnamed sergeant from the Ferguson Police Department. First, here's page 52. You can see the question asked by the prosecutor. Did he, this is Darren Wilson, talk about anything about stealing that occurred at Ferguson Market, that he was stopping these two to investigate that? The answer from the sergeant, he said he did not have that call. That call, I later found out, was given to Officer Blank. That's redacted. Question, did he know about it? Did he talk about knowing about the stealing? Answer, he did not know anything about the stealing call. Question, he told you he did not know anything about the stealing? And then it goes to the next page. He did not know anything. He was out on another call in the apartment complex adjacent to Canfield Green. Okay, so then when he's stopping these two, it is strictly about the sidewalk. It has nothing to do with him investigating the stealing of cigarillos. Is that correct? Answer, that is correct. So this Ferguson police sergeant, the first one who was on the scene and the first one to talk to Officer Wilson, specifically says that Officer Wilson said that he didn't know about the call. And then actually, if you go to 57, you can see the page 57 of the transcript. You can do I have this right here? Yeah, 57 and 58 here. You can see the prosecutor tries to clear it up, saying, I also want to clarify something else, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but it was along the same lines. This is from Prosecutor Kathy Elisa Day, trying to clear up that previous questioning from Sheila Worley, the other prosecutor. So I want to also clarify something else, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but it was along the same lines. You testified that when Sheila asked you some questions, Miss Worley, that Officer Wilson did not know about the stealing that was going on or had just occurred at Ferguson Market. And then further down on page 58, now my question to you is this: are you saying that because he told you he didn't know about it, or are you saying that because he didn't mention it to you when you were talking to him? He did not mention it to me again. I learned about it at a later time. Has he ever told you, yeah, I didn't know anything about what happened at the market? Yes, he has told me that in subsequent conversations. He told you he didn't know about there being a stealing at the Ferguson Market? Correct. Okay, so in case you thought it was ambiguous that he didn't know about it, or that but that couldn't be any clearer than actually you can see the prosecutor there is cross-examining that sergeant pretty vigorously to try to make it sound like, oh, he didn't tell you, but he might have known about it. He just didn't tell you. But he said, no, he told me he didn't know. So it couldn't be much clearer than he specifically told me he didn't know about the stealing at Ferguson Market. But that didn't stop Officer Darren Wilson from testifying several times in his own testimony that he did know about the stealing at the Ferguson Market. Here, starting on this is page 202 of that volume 5 there. You can see Officer Darren Wilson, question from the prosecutor, okay, did you get any calls between that time you were at a sick baby call, which is why he was out there at the Canfield Apartments, and your interaction with Michael Brown and Dorian Johnson? And his answer, while I was on the sick call case, a call came out for stealing in progress from the local market on West Florissant that the suspect's traveling toward QT. I didn't hear the entire call. I was on my portable radio, which isn't exactly the best. I did hear that a suspect was wearing a black shirt and that a box of cigarillos was stolen. Okay, and this was your call? And no, it was not my call. I just heard the call. So you can see already on page 202 of the transcript, he's claiming that he did hear the call, and he mentions it several times. Here, I'm going to go over now to page 209 of the transcript. You can see this is, when I started looking at Brown, this is Darren Wilson's testimony. First thing I noticed, in his right hand, his hand is full of cigarillos. And that's when it clicked for me, because I now saw the cigarillos. I looked in my mirror. I did a double check that Johnson was wearing a black shirt. These are the two from the stealing. And then they kept walking. So he specifically says that after they started talking, but before there was any violence, that he put together the cigarillos and the black shirt and the stealing at the Ferguson Market, even though I showed you he told that sergeant that he didn't know about the stealing at all during the entire encounter. But there's almost no cross-examination on that. Here, I'll show you again on page 234 of the transcript. When the prosecutor says, okay, you never did talk to him, Michael Brown, about the cigarillos or stealing at the Ferguson Market. No, I never had the chance to. And then, so they bring that up again, the prosecutors, the fact that he never asked Michael Brown about that. And then over on page 240 of the transcript, he's claiming that he said on the radio, Frank 21, I'm on Canfield with 2, send me another car, although that was never received by the dispatcher. In another part of the transcript, he says he had it on the wrong channel. And then the question is, it wasn't a stressful situation at that point? Answer, no, it wasn't, but I just had that gut feeling that someone else needed to be there, and knowing that this guy just stole from the market because I saw the cigarillos and had the black shirt, I felt that in order to effect the arrest, it would be better to have you asked for this other car before any words were exchanged. No, he'd already said, fuck what you have to say. So you can see he brings up the market and the cigarillos again on that part of the transcript. And then on page 253 and 254, you see this answer. Whenever they walk me, and I saw the cigarillos, I'd already saw that Dorian Johnson had on a black shirt. But just to double check myself to match up with what I had heard, cigarillos had been stolen and suspect wearing a black shirt, I looked to make sure the shirt was black. And that's where he's talking about what he saw in his rear view mirror. And the last part of the transcript I want to show, this is the only place where the prosecutors bring up what that sergeant said, and they don't use it to impeach him at all. They actually try to make it sound like it's a misunderstanding. It says, you didn't say anything to blank about the cigarillos, did you? And this, from the context, this page 257, if you look back on 256, you'll see from the context they're talking about the sergeant. And you didn't say anything about the cigarillos, did you? Yes. You believe you did? Yes, ma'am. So he's actually, on that page, Officer Darren Wilson is claiming he told the sergeant about the cigarillos and the whole stealing thing, even though the sergeant explicitly said that he told him he didn't know about it, and they never cross-examined him on that. And I showed you, he told the grand jury like at least half a dozen times that he thought about that convenience store robbery, and that these two were the suspects, as he thought about that during the encounter. He saw the cigarillos. There's this one really weird part where he says that when Michael Brown was like punching him, he stopped punching him, handed the cigarillos over to his friend, said, "Here, take these," or something like that, and then went back and started punching him again. That's one of the kind of unbelievable things in Officer Darren Wilson's story. And one reason I think that this idea that he's a wanted suspect in a convenience store strong-arm robbery is really important is because of this weird legal jury instruction that the prosecutors gave to the grand jury. I'm not going to show you a clip, but I put a link down in the video description to this Lawrence O'Donnell MSNBC show, Last Word, a segment he did on the shocking mistake in the Darren Wilson grand jury, where he talks about how the prosecutors told the grand jury for almost the entire time that they were deliberating and before Darren Wilson testified that the Missouri law for use of force says that officers can shoot fleeing felons, even though that was found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1985. But they gave them this really old copy of the law that still had the part that said, that had been struck down by the Supreme Court, saying that they could shoot fleeing felons. The police were justified in using force in shooting fleeing felons, which isn't true, and it could be the reason that Darren Wilson spent so much time talking about how he knew that Michael Brown had been involved in this felony strong-arm robbery of the convenience store, even though he told that sergeant, who was the first one on the scene, that he didn't know about the stealing call or the robbery call from the convenience store. So anyway, I hope that all that talking and all those pages from the grand jury transcript were worth the time and the selection that to show how there was definitely a lack of cross-examination and real problems with the way the prosecutor... I mean, that's just one of like many inconsistencies that Officer Darren Wilson could have been cross-examined on if the prosecutors were really acting as prosecutors in the case rather than as almost like defense attorneys for Officer Darren Wilson. I mean, I know the difference between a cross-exam and a direct exam. I don't know, if you're not a lawyer, maybe you don't know what that is, but what they did for Officer Wilson is a direct exam where they are very supportive. They say, you know, what happened next, just like let him testify in almost narrative form and give some sort of fantastical details that were not cross-examined at all. And there were some problems with the investigation where they didn't really look into the distances that don't completely make sense. And I mean, I really wish that this had been in a public, at least a preliminary hearing, if not a trial. I think the evidence would have been examined a lot more closely, and there hopefully the prosecutors wouldn't have been able to get away with what they got away with in front of the grand jury. That is all, even evident from the transcripts. It's nothing like what a prosecutor normally does. So I want to show you that, and I have just a few more clips I want to show before I finish up this program tonight. First, I want to show a few clips on immigration. That's was the big issue last week, and that's still an ongoing controversy. And first, I want to show also from CBS's Face the Nation, Nora O'Donnell had on one of the senators-elect from one of the new Republican senators, Thom Tillis, and also one of the new Democratic senators, Gary Peters, and they both gave their opinion of what's going to happen even immediately and then in the long term on this whole immigration issue. And it kind of sets up, I think, what the Republican and Democratic positions are going to be over in this clip.
Yeah, I'm afraid that the president's unilateral action is going to set us back. I believe that what we should do, first and foremost, is seal the border. The Republicans and Democrats have both failed on this issue for decades, and one of the reasons why is I don't think we've stabilized the problem by taking credible steps to seal the border. Then let's discuss what we do with the population who's illegally present. I think we're going to complicate it. We could end up having a contentious debate that could be avoided.
Mm-hmm. And Senator-elect Peters, you are a member of the House. There's been difficulty getting some agreement with the Senate on the issue of immigration.
It is a source of constant frustration to me because we do have bipartisan agreement. I support the Senate immigration reform bill, which passed on a bipartisan basis. We have organizations like the United States Chamber of Commerce that support the immigration reform bill. 17 Republicans, including folks like Mr. Rubio, Mr. McCain, and in states that are obviously intimately involved in the immigration issue. We have a comprehensive approach. We have an approach that invests nearly $40 billion in border protection, where you got the parties to come together. The Congress needs to act. Instead of wringing their hands about the presidential action, Congress needs to pass a bill. We have a bill that's been on the table for a year and a half in the House. I believe that if the Speaker would put it on the floor, it would actually pass, and we would deal with this issue in a comprehensive way. We need to move forward. If my Republican friends want to work in a bipartisan way and find common ground, we're already almost there with a comprehensive immigration reform. All we have to do is pass it.
All right, we will all be.
So I think Senator-elect Gary Peters' argument about comprehensive immigration reform and Republicans blocking that was much more persuasive than what you saw from this Republican Senator-elect Thom Tillis, his whole border security first thing. But not only is border security first probably going to be the big Republican reaction, I noticed over on NBC's Meet the Press they had another Republican senator-elect, Tom Cotton, who's going to be the youngest senator, and he's kind of a Tea Party guy. And I think he sort of previewed what the Republican reaction to the whole presidential executive action on immigration is going to be, and it's going to be to scare poor white people with the idea that immigrants are going to take their job. You know, isn't it? Remember that from the whole South Park? They took my job. It's going to be Republican Tom Cotton is they took their jobs. That's the Republican reaction that you should be looking forward to, as you can see over in this clip.
Immigration, because you're still a sitting member of the House. Yeah. There's been some speculation that House Republicans this week are going to decide on how to retaliate against the president on his decision. What's the decision going to be?
Well, we'll come back from the Thanksgiving holiday and make a decision about the best way to proceed on a tactical measure, but I think Congress has to stand up to protect our prerogatives, which is say stand up for the American people. You know, the president just lost an election in no small measure because wages for working families are declining and unemployment is still too high in too many places. And the first big action he took after the election was to make it easier for illegal immigrants to get jobs, not for working families to get jobs.
One of the
So yeah, I think you're going to hear a lot more from Republicans about how immigrants took their jobs, as they said on South Park. And I also thought it was kind of amusing when Chuck Todd on NBC's Meet the Press this morning confronted Tom Cotton with some of the rhetoric he used during the election about border security and tying it to terrorism. You know, I think I showed a clip several weeks back of how the Republicans tried to tie both terrorism and Ebola to immigration and the border, and we're not, you know, the Ebola-laden terrorists are coming across the border because Obama isn't securing it. And well, it wasn't quite Ebola-laden terrorists, but Chuck Todd did confront Tom Cotton with something he said about ISIS terrorists coming over the border, and the fact that he hadn't mentioned it during the whole rest of the discussion about immigration this morning, and Tom Cotton didn't back down from his terrorism connection over in this clip.
One other issue during the campaign, I want to ask you about it. Let me play some audio from you about the immigration issue.
Groups like the Islamic State collaborate with drug cartels in Mexico that have clearly shown they're willing to expand outside the drug trade into human trafficking and potentially even terrorism. They could infiltrate our defenseless southern border and attack us right here in places like Arkansas.
You didn't bring up terrorism just now with me. You did in a campaign phone call. Is that just campaign rhetoric?
No, I mean, Hezbollah...
What's the evidence?
No, Hezbollah has tried to launch terrorist attacks right here in Washington, D.C. They're under federal indictment, collaborating with locals in Mexico to cross our border to attack us here. As long as our border is open and it's defenseless, then it's not just an immigration issue, it's a national security issue. And we know that these drug cartels in Mexico are focused primarily on power and profit. They'll branch out into any activity if it brings them more money and helps them consolidate control. That's yet another reason why we have to get control of our border.
But do you worry?
So yeah, that was not a very convincing defense of the overblown rhetoric from Tom Cotton's election campaign about terrorists coming over the border. At least I didn't think so. You can let me know what you think down in the comment section. Like I said, I've been reading your comments along the way, and hopefully by next week I'll have a way to interact with them a little more, because right now they're in this little box that it's very hard for me to look at. Though I do have one more clip I want to show you before I finish the show, and maybe I'll try to get a little respond to a couple comments down in the discussion section. This is on, I often cover splits in the Republican Party because, those make me more happy, I guess, than splits in the Democratic Party. But there was this sort of split in the Democratic Party revealed this week by a speech from New York Senator Chuck Schumer, though in a way he was kind of attacking himself, because he was attacking the Democratic strategy back from 2009 when Obama came in and they had the House and Senate, and how they passed health care instead of working on economic issues and getting jobs and rebounding faster from the recession. And I want to show Chuck Todd asked outgoing Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick about that, and he didn't agree with Chuck Schumer, but I want to show you both sides of that and talk about it a little more before I end the show after this clip.
Shift gears here a little bit to the future of the Democratic Party. I want to play for you a bite from Senator Chuck Schumer, who almost comes across as indicting President Obama's first year in office because he said health care was a mistake. Take a listen.
Democrats blew the opportunity the American people gave them. We took their mandate and put all of our focus on the wrong problem, health care reform. But it wasn't the change we were hired to make. Americans were crying out for the end to the recession, for better wages and more jobs, not changes in health care.
Do you agree with them?
Well, I respect Senator Schumer, but no, I don't agree with him. I mean, I think Americans understand the interconnectedness of a whole host of solutions that government should pay attention to. Not that they think government should solve every problem in their lives, but that government should help them help themselves. And you ask somebody who is not insured and is sick, or someone who is getting buried by healthcare-related debt, whether healthcare reform makes a difference, and they say, and they will tell you that it does make a difference.
Where?
I'm not sure which side I agree with in that split there between Deval Patrick and Chuck Schumer. I mean, I'm not all that happy with the healthcare reform that was passed. I mean, it's better than nothing, and I guess in a way it's a big accomplishment to get something passed, but that's about the best you can say. I mean, there are good parts to it, but it's not single payer, and it's more a giveaway to the insurance companies, though it has, some patient bill of rights in there, and I don't know. So it did seem like a lot of effort for not the greatest plan, but it may have been the best plan that could pass the Senate with even with the 60 votes they had, because several of those Democratic senators also had to be placated in terms of what the insurance companies wanted. And I don't know, you can tell me what you think about that possible split in the Democratic Party. And I think Chuck Schumer is actually a good friend of Hillary Clinton's, since they were both New York senators for a while. And I don't know if he's doing some sort of ideological blazing for the Clinton campaign. I mean, that would be kind of an ironic twist if Hillary Clinton all of a sudden came out against trying to do health care too soon after Hillary care was such a disaster for the Clinton administration, to say that Obama did health care too soon, and using Chuck Schumer to make that argument first. I don't know. Maybe that's what's happening. Anyway, I got to finish up the program pretty soon. I actually did not get any of the donations. You know, if you're watching this as a recorded show and you put the mouse up over that corner, you should see like a little eye where if you're in the United States, Japan, Canada, or Australia, you can donate to my channel so I don't have to put so many commercials. I think I may have to put them in at every 15 minutes this week, but maybe I can do better next week. And this Wednesday, also look out for LiberalViewer First Wednesday live Q&A, where I will interact a lot more with the viewers, and you can post questions now on my Facebook, facebook.com/LiberalViewer, or Twitter, twitter.com/LiberalViewer. What else would my Facebook and Twitter be? But you can post questions for me to answer with a little research beforehand for my show Wednesday. First Wednesday of the month is this Wednesday, December 3rd, and that's at 4:30 p.m. Pacific. And also keep watching. Next week, my show may actually be delayed. It might be 6 to 12 hours later, because next week is the annual ACLU Bill of Rights Day event that I go to in San Francisco, and so I won't have time to finish the show by 6:30 p.m., but I may end up with some really interesting video, especially of this internet free speech pioneer, Pamela Samuelson, Professor Pamela Samuelson, who's getting an award, and hopefully I'll get permission to record her speech, and I may be able to upload that around the time of the show next week, and then I'll let you know based on how long it takes. I may do it at like 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. or even 10 a.m. on Monday instead of on Sunday, because I want to be able to go through and pick all the clips. I hope you enjoyed the 20 or so clips that I picked out for you this morning, as well as those excerpts from the grand jury transcript to show how there was bad cross-examination of Officer Darren Wilson. I noticed I had about 150 people, even 140 people at this point. So, I got up to 151 people at one point. So thanks all of you for joining me. I've been reading your comments along the way, and hopefully I'll be able to interact with them a little better outside of this little box. I'm going to experiment with that on Wednesday and see if I open up my own video window, if it overloads my CPU so I can't broadcast. That's what I'm afraid of. If I actually open up the video that you all have open, and then I can read the comments there, that it's going to overtax my computer so I can't broadcast. But I guess I'll try that on Wednesday and hopefully have it worked out for you next Sunday and interact with you, my live viewers, a little more. And in any case, I hope you enjoyed the show, and I'll be seeing you next week and subsequent weeks at the regular time of 6:30 p.m. Pacific, and I guess I'll be seeing you all around the internet.